All right, welcome back. Today, we're going to dive into a world you've probably never thought about, the hidden finance of farming. It's a place governed by a really fascinating accounting standard called IAS 41, and it's all about tackling one huge challenge. How do you put a price tag on nature itself?
Think about it. It all boils down to this one deceptively simple question. How in the world do you put a price on a living thing for a financial statement? Turns out, it's way more complicated than it sounds.
Look, if you've got a standard business asset, like a factory machine, accounting for it is pretty straightforward. You know the drill. Its value goes down over time in a nice, predictable way. We call that depreciation. But a dairy cow? That's a whole different ballgame. It doesn't just sit there and lose value. It grows. It produces milk. It might even have calves. Its value is constantly changing in all these complex biological ways. And that's the core problem that traditional accounting rules just weren't built to handle.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to really define this living problem in accounting. Then, we'll introduce the special rulebook designed for nature. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of how you value these assets, uncover a really clever distinction the rules make, and finally, we'll zoom out to look at the bigger picture.
So, the solution to this puzzle comes in the form of International Accounting Standard 41, or just IAS 41. The title is simple: agriculture. It's the specialized set of rules made specifically for the business of farming.
Now, the key word here, the one that really matters, is management. See, IAS 41 isn't about just harvesting from the wild. It only kicks in when you are actively managing the transformation of living things. Raising livestock, cultivating crops. So, catching fish out in the open ocean, that doesn't count. But running a managed fish farm? Yep, that's covered. It's all about actively overseeing that biological change. Okay, so what exactly is in the scope here? Well, the standard covers three main things: the biological assets themselves, we're talking living animals and plants, the agricultural produce right at the moment it's harvested, like an apple the second it's picked from the tree, and it also covers certain government grants that are tied to these activities.
And, just as important is what it doesn't cover. The land the farm is on? Nope, that's handled by a different standard. Same goes for something called bearer plants. Think of them as living factories, and we'll circle back to that in a minute. And this is a big one. IAS 41 stops cold at the point of harvest. The process of taking those harvested grapes and turning them into wine, that's manufacturing, and it falls under a whole different set of inventory rules.
All right, let's lock in the key terms so we're all on the same page. A biological asset is, well, it's exactly what it sounds like: a living animal or a plant. Nice and simple.
And agricultural produce is simply the product that you harvest from that biological asset. So it's the wool from the sheep, the milk from the cow, the fruit from the tree.
This table right here lays out that distinction perfectly. Let's take the sheep. That's your biological asset. The moment its wool is sheared, that wool becomes agricultural produce and it's under IAS 41. But as soon as that wool is sent to a mill and processed into yarn, it becomes standard inventory, and IAS 41 doesn't apply anymore. You can see that same clear handoff for cattle and milk, trees and logs, grapes and wine.
So if we know what we're measuring, the next huge question is, how do we actually put a number on these living things? And this brings us to the absolute core of IAS 41. And honestly, this is where the standard gets really innovative.
Instead of using historical cost and then depreciating it, IAS 41 uses something totally different. It's called fair value less costs to sell. It sounds a little jargony, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It just asks, what could we sell this asset for in the market right now, today, minus any direct costs of making that sale? It's all about current market value, not what you paid for it years ago.
And here's the real kicker. This is the part that changes everything. Under IAS 41, you recognize changes in value as they happen, not just when you sell something. So, if your herd of cattle grows bigger and becomes more valuable over the course of a year, you recognize that increase in value as a gain for that year, even if you haven't sold a single cow. This gives a much more up-to-date picture of how the farm is actually doing.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. The standard itself has this perfect little line that makes it crystal clear. It says a gain can arise when a calf is born. Think about that. A new life is created, and with it, a new asset. The farm can immediately recognize a gain based on the fair value of that newborn calf. It's accounting that actually reflects the reality of life. Pretty cool, right?
Okay, now for a really clever distinction that the standard makes, because it turns out not all plants are treated the same way. The rulebook came up with this brilliant way to separate the factory from the product.
So an apple tree, which makes apples year after year, is treated like a piece of equipment, like a machine in a factory. They call it a bearer plant, and it's actually accounted for under IAS 16, the standard for property and equipment. But the apples themselves, while they're growing on the tree, that's the agricultural produce, and that falls right back under our standard IAS 41.
To officially be a bearer plant, it has to check 3 boxes. 1, it's used to produce things. 2, it's expected to do that for more than 1 year. And 3, you're probably not going to chop it down and sell the plant itself, except for maybe a tiny bit of scrap value at the end of its life. An apple tree fits that perfectly. But a tree that's being grown for lumber, that doesn't fit, because the tree is the final product.
All right, to wrap things up, let's quickly touch on 2 other key pieces that give us the full picture of how IAS 41 really works.
First up, government grants. The rules here are pretty straightforward. If a grant has no strings attached, you just recognize it as income as soon as you know you're getting it. But if the grant is conditional, like say you have to farm in an environmentally friendly way for 5 years, you can only recognize that income as you meet those conditions. Simple as that.
And finally, to make sure investors aren't being left in the dark, the standard demands a ton of transparency. Companies have to disclose their total gains or losses from all these fair value changes. They have to describe their different groups of living assets, and they even have to provide physical quantities, the actual number of cattle they own or how many gallons of milk they produced. This is all about connecting the financial numbers back to the physical reality on the farm.
So when you put it all together, why does any of this matter? Well, the whole point of IAS 41 is to give us a financial report that actually reflects what's going on in an agricultural business. By using current market prices and recognizing gains as they happen, it gives investors and managers a way more timely and realistic view of that company's true performance and its financial health.
There's no doubt that this standard is a brilliant financial tool for understanding the business of nature. But it does leave us with a much bigger, kind of philosophical question to chew on. By getting so incredibly good at measuring nature in financial terms, are we really mastering it, or are we just getting better at commodifying it? Something to think about.